Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this Maths Anxiety webinar. I'm Lucy Chowns and I'm Head of Maths at Pearson, and I'll be chairing the discussion today. Math skills are so important to our everyday lives as well as in education and work, and that's why at Pearson we want to provide opportunities and pathways for all learners to be confident and successful in maths. But research suggests that around a third of adults experience maths anxiety, and for many individuals that anxiety starts in childhood. So we need to tackle this barrier if we're going to set learners up for success in maths. We held our first roundtable on this important topic back in 2019 and published our first Tackling Maths Anxiety guide soon after that. A lot's happened since then, and there's been some brilliant progress made across the sector. But we continue to be committed to tackling maths anxiety, and we recently released a new edition of our Tackling Maths Anxiety guide. This webinar today is also a great opportunity to continue the conversation. So just before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. So please note that your cameras and microphones have been turned off, and you'll not be able to use those during this session. The chat feature has also been turned off, but if you have any questions, please do use the Q&A functionality to share those with us at any point during the discussion. There'll be a section for Q&A at the end, and we hope to answer as many questions as possible. But if we don't manage to get through them all, we will pick up on them and share responses after the session. So with all of that said, let's get started. So I'm delighted to be joined today by our speakers, Bobby Seagull and Dr. Thomas Hunt, who have lots of interesting insights to share. So I'll hand over to them to introduce themselves and their interest in this topic. So Bobby, can I come to you first to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, so my name is Bobby Seagull. I'm a maths teacher, author, TV presenter, and actually got my media break about 7 years ago. I was on a quiz show called University Challenge. I went viral for being enthusiastic, and since then I had a lovely platform where I do my sort of television and media work, but as someone, let's say, practicing classroom teacher, I use my platform to talk about maths, whether it's on being on a Netflix dating show where they film my year 8 classes, or whether it's on Pilgrimage, a BBC show, looking at maths, how that can tell us whether we can make a probabilistic account of whether God exists or not. So for me, maths is always a big part of my life. But as someone that has again been a student, a learner, and now a teacher and educator, I know that for everyone, or not for everyone, maths isn't always joyful. It can be a challenging experience. And I've seen my own students sometimes freeze. Even myself, occasionally I get maths anxiety if I'm put on the spot. So this is such an important topic we're discussing here today, because all of us are here today because we think that we can change attitudes towards maths and help tackle maths anxiety.
Brilliant, thanks Bobby. And Tom?
Yeah, thanks. So, hi everyone, I'm Dr. Tom Hunt. I'm an associate professor in psychology at the University of Derby. Like Bobby, I'm very passionate about maths anxiety, about encouraging confidence in maths. My background as a psychologist is very much around the application of psychology to maths education. So I lead the maths anxiety research group at the University of Derby, and we've spent many years researching maths anxiety. So I definitely approach this from a sort of academic researcher perspective, but I'm really keen to work with a range of people, especially teachers, who obviously experience maths anxiety and other emotions, on a day-to-day basis, either themselves or with students. So it's really important for me that we hold events like this really to kind of bring everybody together.
Brilliant, thanks Tom. Okay, so to kick things off, we'll start by talking a little bit about what maths anxiety is and why it's really important to think about. So Tom, I'm going to come to you first with a really fundamental question. What is maths anxiety and how does it manifest itself?
Yeah, so in some ways it sounds like a really straightforward question, doesn't it? What is maths anxiety? And I think we've all got a sort of implicit maybe idea as to what it is. We know what maths is roughly. We know what anxiety is very broadly. So I think we've got a general idea of what maths anxiety is, but it's actually quite complex. It's quite broad in nature. So the way I often describe it is it's a negative, emotional, cognitive, behavioural response to mathematics. Okay, and you know, when we talk about mathematics, for me, that can be many different things. You know, people have different ideas as to maybe which parts of mathematics or what kind of interaction with mathematics actually generates anxiety. And, you know, it is many things. So it might be actual mathematical problem solving that generates the anxiety. I think it could be the context. So it might be learning mathematics, being in a maths classroom, for example, doing a maths test. It might be being in some kind of, you know, social context, being in a restaurant, for example, and working out your, you know, share of the bill, that kind of thing. And it might be, as I say, to do with the actual type of maths itself. So, for example, some people get extremely anxious when it comes to more abstract maths, algebra, for example, compared to, say, you know, simple addition or multiplication. So it's usually varied in that sense. But, you know, some of the consistent aspects are certainly this sense of panic, sometimes upset even, and a general sense of stress, tied with a lot of worry as well, a lot of kind of unhelpful, intrusive thoughts, or maybe around your own perceived ability, for example, or worries around, you know, feeling embarrassed and that kind of thing. And as I say, there's a huge behavioural aspect to it as well, in terms of, you know, the impact on performance, but also in terms of how you just feel behaviorally. You know, we know, you know, that typical kind of panic response that we have from time to time, where we might feel hot and sweaty, we might feel our heart racing, these kinds of things. And, you know, these are common experiences amongst those who, you know, are highly maths anxious. So, you know, it is quite tricky to sort of pinpoint exactly what it is, because it does, you know, it affects people in many different ways, and we see a lot of individual differences in the way that it manifests. But, you know, certainly in terms of that kind of upset, worrisome thoughts, sort of physiological, you know, responses, they're the sort of key things that we often see.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And Bobby, you're obviously bringing your kind of on the ground maths teaching experience. So can you talk to us a bit about what maths anxiety looks or feels like in a school?
So from my classroom experience, it's something that I see pretty much every time I'm in a lesson. There'll be examples where students, you know, I'd have explained a topic on the whiteboard. I was going to say chalkboard, but it's not chalk anymore, it's a whiteboard nowadays. And then I'll pass out a worksheet, and students will push the worksheet back before they've even looked at it. So clearly they've got this mental block. There'll be other students when I'll set homework, whether it's digital or whether it's paper, they'll avoid doing it. Or even people sometimes that are actually quite competent in the subject, they'll feel anxious about coming to lessons, even though they're doing, you know, even though they're performing quite well. So people often assume that maths anxiety is with students that struggle, but actually can impact everyone, whether you're someone that's a strong mathematician or someone that's struggling. And what I've generally seen is that maths anxiety, the issue is it leads to avoidance of the subject. And then the avoidance means that if you're continually avoiding the subject, like a camel putting your head under the sand, it means, or an ostrich rather, camels don't put their head, ostriches put their head, bury their head on the ground. It means that they're not progressing. And ultimately, this means that they don't get the results they need, because again, in the UK, even this year, we saw 175,000 children at 16 not getting grade 4. So I know 1 to 3 is a GCSE, but it's not regarded as a pass in terms of moving on to the next level. And then in the UK, we've got this cycle of resits where 80% of children fail resits as well. So clearly that avoidance impacts their ability to get qualifications, and then that impacts their ability for future careers that involve numbers or data, or even like if people are applying for jobs, they'll look at a position and see, oh, it requires maths and numeracy. And that sort of negativity, the anxiety early on has really compounded. But the anxiety, I feel like, is a learned thing. Again, I always tell my students, you know, when they're at a hospital, when they're born and, you know, they're picked up from the maternity ward, the nurse is going like, oh, yep, you have 2 eyes, 2 legs, a mouth. Oh, and there's a bit of maths anxiety. They're definitely not doing that. So I feel like maths anxiety is a learned behavior, which also means you can unlearn it as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And you touched a bit on the kind of impact in later life there. Are there any sort of recommendations that you'd make for what schools could do to support parents, you know, in ways that avoid reinforcing kind of anxiety or blame, how to tackle maths anxiety?
Yes, so I would say I always think about schools as like a big ecosystem. There's obviously the teachers and support staff, and then you've got the students, and they're the key focus. But outside of that, we have the parents and guardians, and they're a big part of making sure that all the sort of that sort of ecosystem is fulfilled properly. And I always what I've done in schools when I've either been a head of department or as a teacher, we've encouraged parents to come into school. So like once every term or half term, we've had parent sessions where I've run little workshops talking about the competence side of maths, like actual like how do you do basic bits, how might you do fractions, or how do you do multiplication, but also the attitude piece, because with maths there's two parts. One is the competence, and then the confidence. With the competence, obviously, if parents have struggled with maths outside of school, as a school teacher, there's not much you can do about that. But the piece on the confidence and attitudes, you can do a lot about it, because I often tell my parents at my school that even if you found maths difficult, never say negative things about the subject, like, oh, maths is useless, oh, your dad does the maths, or actually we'll never need it, because children pick up on these things, and then that adds to the barriers to their learning. So it's all about making sure that parents are bought in into the school ethos, because you obviously, as a teacher, you're with the children. If you're primary, you're with them from like 9 to 3:30, and if you're secondary, you see them a few times a week. But actually, most of the time children spend growing up is outside of the school with their friends, but also with their families. So what you say about maths makes a huge deal. So again, I always encourage parents, if they're out shopping or they're checking the channel to work out what time something's happening, always try and show the practical sides of maths, because the more children can see that maths is not just something in the class and in an exam, and the more it's in the real world, I think the less likely they are to feel anxious about the subject.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So I'd like to dig into a bit more detail on how we can identify children or young people who might be struggling with maths anxiety. So Tom, how can you identify children and young people who are experiencing maths anxiety, and will the signs be the same for all?
Yeah, it's actually, fairly challenging to some extent. I mean, there might be cases, I think, where, children are very upfront about how they feel, and I think in those cases it's perhaps a little bit more straightforward. But I think in many ways the more sort of challenging scenario is where, you have a child who, maybe appears a particular way in maths class, or they don't engage with their homework, or they, potentially underperform when it comes to maths tests. And it's a case of trying to figure out actually what's behind this. Is it anxiety, or is it other things, or is it a general anxiety rather than sort of specific to maths? So I think from that point of view, it can be very, very challenging, especially with much younger children. So I think this is where things like quick tools, strategies to identify maths anxiety can be really helpful. And I think we've moved into a position now where first of all, there are lots of scales available. If we look at this from a measurement point of view, there are lots of very simple self-report measures available, even for quite young children. And some schools now are starting to routinely use those scales to almost identify from that point of view who's higher in maths anxiety, because it might be that especially as a younger child, it's difficult for them to actually articulate their feelings. They might not even have the language to explain this sort of feeling of anxiety. So this is where those kind of self-report measures can actually be quite helpful, because they're answering questions on those measures that use the right kind of language, and we know that they sort of get at the anxiety. So that's just one way. But I would say from a more kind of practical point of view, a kind of day-to-day point of view, it's really about understanding those behaviours that we know are associated with anxiety more generally. So, we've touched on some of this already in terms of avoidance, and I think, avoidance can be looked at in many different ways. At a sort of micro level, if you like, within the classroom, that might be avoidance of eye contact. It might be avoidance in terms of looking away from the board or the teacher, or a worksheet, or it might be going to the toilet more often as a bit of an escape route, if you like, to get out of the class. And then it might be sort of disengagement with homework, and then at those higher levels of disengagement, it might even be a lack of attendance, with older students in particular. And generally, as things progress, that sort of disengagement with even conversations around maths and maybe career plans and things like that. So, all of these subtle things I think become quite helpful. Where it becomes challenging, as I say, is to then sort of think, well, how much of this is down to anxiety per se, and how much of it is down to things like motivation, for example. One of the things why it's so tricky is because those other things like motivation are often tied to anxiety as well. So this is where the context, I would say, becomes massively important. So if you're observing these behaviors, these anxiety related behaviors within a maths context, but not elsewhere, then this sort of might lead you to think, well, this is something to do with mathematics. And this is often, again, one of the challenges, because it requires, I think, you as a teacher, as an educator, as a some other professional, to have that broader awareness, that holistic perspective of how that learner behaves, how their anxiety might manifest within those different contexts. And I think one of the other things as well that springs to mind is, as I say, performance, because what you often find is if you're higher in maths anxiety, you might struggle more when it comes to evaluation. So, particularly under kind of high stakes test situations, we see this what's called an affective drop in performance. So you might find that the anxiety kind of gets in the way, if you like, of that learner's ability to perform. So it could be that within maths you see this kind of odd drop in performance that, again, you perhaps don't see in those other subject areas. So that can be an indicator, again, of anxiety.
It's really interesting. Thanks, Tom. You touched there a little bit on tools or approaches that schools might be using to identify students that have maths anxiety. Question to both of you, really, but I'll come to you first, Tom. Just if there's any particular tools or approaches that you'd recommend that you've seen used effectively, it'd be great to hear a bit about those.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. If we look at, for example, the academic literature on this, there's a fair few kind of targeted interventions that have been tested. Still not as many as is needed, and it can be quite varied in terms of the context that these are tested in terms of places in the world, in terms of level of education and things like that. But they broadly, I would say, can be kind of fragmented in terms of emotional strategies, sort of regulation of emotions. So one of the first things really that's going to be helpful if you have a student that panics, for example, particularly in those sort of exam type situations, is to just really help with emotion regulation. So activities like mindfulness, relaxed breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, and various other strategies. It might be the use of music, colouring, all of these kinds of things, through a bit of trial and error in some way with each individual learner, to work out what works for them in terms of emotion regulation. So I would say anything around emotion regulation is helpful, because if you're in a panicked state, clearly you're not in a position to learn effectively or to perform to your best ability. So certainly regulating emotion is a big part of it. I would say another sort of category, if you like, is kind of more cognitive interventions. So I guess this relates to what we spoke about before in terms of that link to things like motivation, but also linked to mindset as well. So if we look at tools such as the Mathematical Resilience Toolkit that my colleague Sue Johnston-Wilder and others have put together, part of that is the use of the sort of growth zone model. So to help learners understand, where within those zones they feel within a given situation. So it helps to really understand, I guess, from the point of view of the individual learner, what is it that makes me feel really stressed and anxious? Is it a particular type of maths? Is it a particular situation, for example, rather than having this kind of really big view of I just hate maths or I'm terrible at maths. Actually breaking it down to really understand your own responses within those specific situations. And also I would say within that kind of broader umbrella of cognitive approaches, we're starting to see more success in terms of things like appraisal as well, because what we know from the general anxiety literature is that if you're feeling anxious, you're more likely to appraise situations in a very kind of threatening or stressed way. So you might approach a relatively kind of non-threatening, neutral situation like a maths class. It's not inherently dangerous or scary, but you might feel that kind of anxious response as though it is dangerous or scary in some way. So activities around appraising how you feel can be really important. So if we look at analogies like in sports, for example, and I've done this before with older students especially, I'll say think of a situation where you actually feel physiologically, mentally aroused, and kind of ready for a challenge. And that might be thinking through to being in some kind of competition, sports competition, a music event, something where you're maybe performing to some extent. And you might feel some nerves and you might feel even a little bit anxious, but you sort of interpret that in a slightly different way because of the context, and you might just see that as, oh, it's an adrenaline rush. Actually, this is my body, my brain preparing itself for the challenge ahead. So I think this idea of reappraisal is really important because we often don't talk about it within more kind of cognitive domains like mathematics. So students kind of get this, as I say, physiological, mental arousal, and rather than interpreting it in a very negative kind of threatening way, almost flipping it on its head and actually thinking, well, actually this is almost a positive thing. Obviously we don't want arousal to the extent that it's highly stressful, but understanding that sort of bodily and mental response to the challenge ahead can just change the way that you approach mathematics learning, mathematics tests, and as I say, we're starting to see a little bit more success in that area. But certainly things that kind of combine approaches are probably the best way forward, really, because there is no one size fits all. As I say, individuals really vary in terms of what makes them anxious, in terms of how that's manifested. So having a bit of a toolkit is probably the best way forward.
Brilliant, thank you. And similar question to you then, Bobby. In terms of your experience in the classroom, what you've seen through your own teaching and that of your colleagues, are there any tools or approaches that you would recommend?
Yes. So actually, one of my friends, a fellow maths teacher, Susan Okereke, she has a really good high-level framework for this. Because she and I run a podcast called Maths Appeal, and she always talks about how maths is an emotional subject. And because of that, I think you need to think about that in the way you set up your class. So the emotion means that you need to think about the culture you develop in your classroom. So I've always, since I've been a teacher for the last 11 years, have made sure that I encourage a setting where mistakes are encouraged. Because if imagine you're doing the times tables and everyone's doing the tens times table every single lesson, of course, everyone will get it correct, 10 sevens, 10 eights. But when you try the 7 times table or the 6 times tables, students might make mistakes. And actually then if you're making mistakes, it means that you're probably learning something new. So I always try and create a culture where we don't laugh at students that make mistakes. And even the language, like if someone gets something wrong, I try to, obviously if they're wrong, but I try to avoid using that word wrong and say like, you're not quite right there, have a little think. So I think it's that culture where the growth mindset is where everyone thinks maths is attainable. And again, simple things like the language you use, praising effort rather than the attainment. Because if someone gets 10 out of 10 on a class test, obviously as a teacher you're happy because you want them to move up the milestones. But if other children hear you go, oh, well done, Naomi, you got 10 out of 10, then they think, oh, Naomi's really smart at maths, I can't achieve that. But instead, I'll say, oh, Naomi, you worked really hard this week on your fractions, that's why you did really well on the test. So then people hear that and they go, actually, Naomi worked hard and I can replicate that. So you're changing the language there. And then another thing, probably this is more recently, because I've now, for the last couple of years, been working as a specialist in a primary school. And in my secondary school experience, so I was there for a decade and I had a department. Often, I would, do a question, let's say Pythagoras theorem, and then I'd pick some students. I'd say, James, can you answer that? Or Ahmed, what do you reckon this is? And sort of putting people on the spot. But in primary school, and one of the things I've learned from some of my fellow teachers there, actually, the reason where people get put off maths sometimes is they think that maths is a competition, it's a race. And of course, I know in exams, we got an hour and a half in GCSEs, and ultimately we build up towards that. But in the classroom, you want to build against that culture. So if I ask a question when I'm teaching year 5s or 6s, I'll ask them a fraction question, and I'll say, don't put your hand up straight away. I want you to give it some thought for like 10-20 seconds. So I'll give people time to think, and it reduces the element of competition, because I think it's that timed element that can sometimes make people anxious. So it's all about, I think it's about creating that classroom culture. And again, if you're a teacher listening to this thinking, maths anxiety feels like, is it a recent phenomenon? It's been around for a long time. And I love this little poem from the Elizabethan era, from the 1570s. And it says, I'll read it in my best Shakespearean accent. It's multiplication is vexation, division is as bad, the rule of 3 doth puzzle me, and practice drives me mad. And that's from the 1570s. So maths anxiety, even though they didn't call it that, so in the 1960s and 70s it became a term. Whenever there's numbers and there's a right or wrong answer, people can feel anxious about it. So don't panic. It's not a new thing. It's been around for a while.
Really interesting. Thanks, Bobby. One of the things that we talked about in the new edition of the Tackling Maths Anxiety Guide was the idea of a gender divide when it comes to maths anxiety. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So firstly, Bobby, to you, is there a gender divide when it comes to maths anxiety? And if so, what does that look like?
So this is where there's more and more research coming on the field. King's College London and National Numeracy, a charity I'm an ambassador for, they found research showing that women can be twice as anxious as men. And again, the reasons why it's quite difficult to understand, is it the cultural stereotypes? We're told that boys are meant to be good at maths and girls are meant to be good at reading. These cultural stereotypes persist when people have children and they have a boy and a girl. They might say, oh, the boy, they can do the sciencey math stuff, or the girl, she can do the arty stuff. Again, this is a stereotype, but that stereotype sort of seeps into people's consciousness and may impact the way they teach. So I think a lot of it's about the narrative, because again, from my experience, I think anyone can do maths. Maths is a subject for a person of every gender, every race, every religion. But we sometimes have these stereotypes that seep into a class. The only bit of the sort of outcomes I've seen from academic research is at university level. They've shown that more men get firsts and thirds in the sciences and maths compared to women. And again, it's like the chicken and egg situation. Is that because we've created a culture where we encourage boys to take more risks and girls to be more safe in the classroom? And again, it's tricky to know. But what I will say is that the way you set up the classroom does make a difference. Again, when I've taught students, telling them to not just get the answer, but talk through the method. Because sometimes I've had lessons where I'll ask a question and boys will put their hand up and they'll make a mistake. And then I'll ask a question 2 minutes later and they'll put their hand up again and make the same mistake. And again, where that confidence comes from, I'm not sure. But I think we should make sure that when we're teaching maths, we encourage everyone, girls and boys, to be in an environment where they can make mistakes. Because again, as a teacher, the language you say, the words you use, does make an impact. Because if you're overheard in the staff room, even talking to other teachers saying, oh yeah, the boys in my class are really good at maths and the girls are not, that reinforces stereotypes among the children and staff members in the way in which they treat people. So I think it's really about a lot of work about stereotyping and trying to change that and show that maths really is for everyone.
Great, thank you. Tom, can I come to you on this as well? From what you've seen with the research, what's your view on sort of why it appears to be the case that girls struggle more with maths anxiety than boys?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always worth sort of taking a step back when we look at, these kind of statistics, because it is pretty consistent, in terms of different phases of education or ages, different countries, even, across the world. We do see a fairly consistent pattern of girls and women are reporting higher levels of maths anxiety. And there's different ways that people have sometimes viewed that. We can, of course, assume that represents a real difference. But it can also be, partly a measurement issue as well. So, most of this work stems from, self-report measures. It's how individual students, reflect on their own anxiety and report that. So, we always have to bear in mind, is it, for example, that girls and women are just more aware of their own feelings, their own anxiety? Do they have that, greater ability, if you like, to sort of self-reflect in that way? Is it something to do with a greater willingness to actually report how you feel? So again, there could be that sort of stereotype in terms of, I'm a boy, I don't want to say that I'm anxious, sort of thing. So there's those sorts of arguments that crop up, and I think, you know, some of that might well be, you know, valid. My personal thought is that there is such a consistent, you know, effect, like I say, across the world, even, that, you know, it probably does reflect a real difference to some extent. And it might well be that it's in part down to a stereotype threat, like you know, Bobby suggested. There's also arguments and probably some evidence to suggest that if we look at other anxieties, those other anxieties could potentially at least explain some of that difference. So greater levels of general anxiety, for example, amongst girls and women, greater levels of test anxiety as well. And we know that if that fear of evaluation is a big part of maths anxiety. And I think it's interesting, you know, what Bobby mentioned earlier around competition, because this is something that, you know, appears within the maths education system, you know, in lots of places quite early on, this sense of, you know, needing to have speeded responses. You know, this is almost seen as being synonymous with being good at maths if you do it quickly. You know, this is something that we learn from a very young age, and actually it is very context, you know, specific. You know, like Bobby rightly points out, it's very different in the classroom when you're learning something compared to if there's a requirement, for example, as part of a you know, a speeded test. So you know, some of these debates, I think, feed into the gender debate. If we look at how maths is sometimes taught from a point of view of competition, and how that might feed into test anxiety and general anxiety, and a general fear of failure and fear of negative evaluation from peers as well, because, you know, kids are quite quick from a young age to place themselves in a hierarchy, and some of the research that we've done at Derby has really shown that. You know, if we look at 4, 5, 6-year-olds, they're very quick to sort of identify where they sit in relation to peers, you know, using things like, you know, how quick they are at maths. You know, such and such is quicker than me, and I'm the third fastest on my table, and these kinds of things. And, you know, this does feed into that sense of competition in terms of a hierarchy, and it really feeds into this fear of evaluation from a young age. So some of these arguments, I think, have been used to, you know, potentially explain that gender difference.
Really interesting, thank you.
Lucy, can I just add one more example on this?
Of course,
so often,
yeah.
especially in the gender divide, so there's a piece of research done by Professor Jo Bowler. So she's a British academic that moved to Stanford University, and her research was on what parents say to children and how it impacts their attainment. And she found with her research, it's done in America, but I found it really fascinating, that if mothers say to girls, oh, maths isn't for us, your dad will sort out the maths, etc., there's an almost immediate drop off in the attainment of girls in the classroom in school. So again, if you're a mother out there, or you're someone that's got a daughter, the language you use with children, for girls in particular, again, maybe because women are more emotionally aware, well, I'm not sure what the reason is, but there's a huge, they take that on board, and it impacts their actual attainment in the class. And I found that really fascinating.
Yeah, that is fascinating, thank you. So we talked a lot about maths anxiety for students, but I wanted to talk a little bit about teachers. So it'd be great to explore the idea of teacher maths anxiety and maths teaching anxiety in a bit more detail, and that's something that we've gone into in the latest version of the guide. So Tom, can you tell us a bit about what the difference is between teacher maths anxiety and teaching maths anxiety?
Yeah, so I think if we just take, you know, more general maths anxiety that we've been talking about so far, this, you know, this is experienced by some teachers in the same way as others. You know, teachers are people at the end of the day, and, you know, they've got their own kind of experiences of maths, you know, through childhood and education and adulthood. So, you know, in the same way as everybody else, there's going to be some individual variation and just general anxiety towards maths as a subject. But it is a really important distinction to start looking at maths teaching anxiety. So anxiety specifically in the context of teaching maths. And that is related to a general maths anxiety, but actually, you know, it's a very specific context. So we're talking about how anxious people feel when they're, for example, in the classroom, they're actually teaching maths, they're interacting with students and so on. And I would say, broadly speaking, this sort of teaching specific maths anxiety can probably boil down really to anxiety to do with yourself as a teacher and your own confidence. So it might be that I feel, quite stressed and anxious because I don't have much confidence in my own maths ability or my ability to teach maths, for instance. But equally, it could be that anxiety derives from the students as well. So a sort of real fear or worry that maybe students aren't getting it, that they're not understanding mathematical concepts, or maybe they're not performing to expectations when it comes to maths tests. So it is really important to sort of bear in mind that distinction between the two anxieties, because of course they're related, but actually they're two very separate things. So we've got this kind of high level, maths anxiety, which is anxiety, towards maths more generally. And then you've got this teaching maths anxiety, which is much more specific to, teaching scenarios. And even then it can be sort of broken down in that way.
Okay, thank you. That was really helpful. Any strategies that teachers could adopt to help themselves if that's what they're experiencing?
I think first of all, this is something that, is only recently really starting to get the recognition that it deserves. I think if we look back in the literature, there are, hints at this being a challenge, particularly older research from decades ago that focuses on students. And if you look closely enough, you start to see that actually the most maths anxious students are often those who are training to work in education. That might be, doing a degree in education or actually training to be a teacher. So that's interesting, in itself. And it's something that's not been addressed for a long time, I think probably for all sorts of reasons, in terms of, maybe again stereotypes or that sort of fear of, being judged. If you are a teacher, you might not be willing to sort of put your hand up and kind of say, actually, I feel quite stressed and quite anxious about this. So I think, with that in mind, we probably not need to start sort of acknowledging the issue. I think, sort of having this highlighted, for example, within the guide is a great step, because it sort of, creates that stepping stone to just simply discuss the issue, the challenge. I think bringing it to the sort of forefront of the minds of leaders means that people can actually do something about this in a supportive way, whether that's through teacher training, for example. That might be through various networks. It might be on a school level in terms of initiatives there. But certainly, raising awareness, I think encouraging staff and teachers more generally to just open up and have that conversation and not feel threatened by it and not feel judged, and creating that more kind of inclusive culture, I think is a massive step in the right direction. And of course, if we look at all the strategies that we've spoken about in terms of maths anxiety generally, particularly things like emotion regulation, these are things that of course can be adopted by teachers just as much as students.
Brilliant, thanks, Tom. And Bobby, similar question to you. Is there any strategies that you would recommend, or anything that you've seen used in your experience?
Yeah, so I'll share my experience from the secondary and primary, because they're slightly different. So in secondary school, when I was the head of department, the language I was using in assemblies or at staff meetings was that maths is not just a subject that us maths teachers teach. Every single person, every single adult in the school is a teacher of maths in some way. And for this to work, one is that we try to create a culture where maths was seen as something that's not a fixed skill set. It's something where you might not be at the level of competence you want to be now, but with hard work and time, you can feel more confident. So I would say, again, getting your senior leader, your head teacher on board to try and create a culture where, as Tom talked about, where it's open, it's inclusive. So in my school, we used to do weekly, we didn't call it remedial classes, but there was a better name for it. But we had weekly sessions where teachers could come in and work on maths. So they felt unconfident about certain things in their life about numeracy. They could build their confidence, because sometimes as a maths teacher, let's say in secondary, you can, preach about maths and be really confident in your class. But when your student goes to another subject, let's say history or PE or music, and again, it could be any subject, and another teacher goes, oh yeah, Mrs. Seagull's quite good at maths, but maths isn't really necessary. That can then damage that child's view about mathematics, and therefore could potentially impact their anxieties on the subject. So I think it's getting that whole school culture. And at a primary school level, obviously in primary school, every single teacher or teaching system will be involved in maths in some shape or form, which is different to secondary in that aspect. But sometimes I've seen in primary school, there are teachers that are year 3 or year 4 teachers that won't apply for year 6 jobs because they're thinking, oh, I'm not confident about teaching maths in year 6. And again, I think similar in terms of the culture. Senior leaders, if they can create a culture where they, with students, we always say, have a growth mindset, you can get better. Create that same culture for teachers where it's okay if you struggle with maths, but what are you doing to try and get better at it? And it's about allowing people to have that conversation and then creating workshops, structures in school where teachers can improve their skill set in mathematics. Because once they improve and they realize actually they too themselves have the growth mindset, I think then the whole culture changes, and then everyone has that sort of can do. It's okay to make mistakes, because in schools where students and teachers feel as if, oh, if I make a mistake in maths, I get judged, then it's not the right attitude.
That's really helpful. Thank you both. So I'm going to move us on to just talk a little bit about kind of wider societal considerations. So I can see we've got a little question in the Q&A about this as well. So Bobby, I'm interested in your thoughts about sort of media narratives, like, I'm not a maths person. We've all heard people say those sorts of things. How do those affect children and young people's attitudes? And is there anything that you would kind of ask people to think differently about in relation to that?
Yeah, and I would say this is huge. Probably one of the biggest issues that I felt with in terms of my professional life, because anytime I do any sort of television appearance or doing an interview for a radio show, the presenter will say, oh, we've got Bobby Seagull here, maths teacher and broadcaster. And pretty much the first thing they'll say to me is, oh, Bobby, you know what? I couldn't do maths at school. I hated it. And they'll have a little chuckle with themselves and their presenters. And it seems like it's a bit of light relief. But imagine every single presenter does this, every single Instagram influencer, every single politician. And even when Rishi Sunak, about 21 months ago, made an announcement about maths till 18. Okay, I think there are issues about how you would structure that. But when he talked about maths in public, a lot of the media response like, oh, maths isn't needed, maths is useless. And I think that narrative does impact and seep into young people's attitudes. And I'll give you one sort of analogy. So like about 20 years ago when I was growing up, cigarette smoking was seen as cool because like Formula One cars would have all these ads on the side, but then ads for cigarette smoking got banned. Obviously there's vaping now, as a separate issue, but over time, because cigarette smoking was seen as less cool, it's not as popular. It's not like, again, students in my secondary school, they don't smoke like in the same way in which students in my school did. So it showed that big societal changes can happen, but they take time. So I think with this, what can individuals do? Again, at parents' evenings, the number of times, parents will come to me at the maths table and I look at their son or daughter's report. Mum or dad will say, oh, don't worry, son, I couldn't do maths at school. And again, it's that reinforcement that maths is something that is a fixed skill. But from my experience and what we've seen and what Tom's talking about, maths is a subject with growth mindset. Fair enough, you might not become a Nobel Prize winner or a Fields medalist in maths, but to reach the competence and confidence you need to handle numbers and maths on a day-to-day basis, that's something that pretty much all of us can do. So I think it's that language you use and that feeds into the narrative.
Great, thanks, Bobby. And Tom, a question for you. So why can maths classrooms and the curriculum feel intimidating for students, and what can we do to change that?
Yeah, I mean, if we think about it, maths classrooms have changed a little bit in the last couple of decades. They are friendlier places, generally speaking, especially sort of at primary level. They're more fun. I think we have teachers now who are much more engaging. They make maths more enjoyable.
Thanks,
but
Tom.
they fundamentally classrooms are still quite fixed in terms of the setup, in terms of desks and chairs, and often being in a single room and often having that isolation from other kind of subject areas. So that sort of sort of distinct aspect of maths, in the sense that it's it's its own subject. It's sort of perceived in that way. You're entering a room that's a maths class, for example. If you're already kind of primed to feel anxious, that constantly reinforces those feelings of anxiety, because it might just be that you step foot in the classroom and your anxiety levels increase because of how anxious you already feel. So without sort of changing that context, that there is a risk there in terms of almost teaching maths and asking learners to learn maths in an environment that they've previously learnt to feel anxious in. So to some extent things could be shaken up a little bit in terms of physically where people learn maths. So it is a new place. I think we're not sort of holding on to those cues and those memories associated maybe with past experiences. And I think there's probably still a way to go in terms of linking maths up with those other subject areas. And I know there's some great work, that goes on. Like, Bobby does a great job, I think, in terms of, emphasising the value of maths and really sort of bringing it to life. But I don't think that's, widespread enough at the moment. And I think there is a real attitude problem in terms of young people not fully appreciating the application of maths. And that's got to come from different sources, I think, societally, I think in terms of parents, but also probably to some extent from the constraints of the current maths education system. So I think with all the work that's going on in terms of reimagining maths education at the moment, a big part of that for me is around that sort of linking up of those subject areas, really. So students, learners, adults don't necessarily just see maths as this distinct subject that's sort of separate from life and everything else. So I think there's probably a little bit of work that needs doing there.
Really interesting, thank you. We've had some great questions through on the Q&A, so I'm going to stop with my questions and move on to some of those now. So we'll try and get through as many as we can in the time we've got left. I'm going to read out the first question that I've got here, and then I'll see which of you wants to tackle it first. So the question we're going with first is, I'm interested in the link between speed and anxiety. I have outwardly confident students who are driven to do calculations at speed with as many shortcuts as possible. When I slow them down and make them take it step by step because they're making lots of errors, they get quite angry with me or resistant. I think this is because the speed has been their way of blocking the anxiety. Have you met this?
Oh, actually, if I'm getting this right, you're saying there are students that love working through questions really quickly, but then when you ask them to break it down and slow down and explain what they're doing, they get anxious or annoyed. And again, I think I have seen this a few times. And again, stereotypically, it's been more my male students, but occasionally the odd female one as well. And I think it's about, these are students where maybe through other teachers, they've associated that maths accomplishment is about speed in maths. So for them, that's all they think. They think, oh, if I'm to be good at maths, I've got to get it done quickly. And if I'm slowing down, explaining myself, putting my workings out, and again, I've had times where students will get lots of answers, let's say in a GCSE paper, and then they're not showing the working out. They're like, oh, but it's all in there, it's all in my head. And that's but then they get annoyed when you confront them about it. And I think this is probably something that they've been taught over years. Actually, getting maths done quickly is the way to do maths. So I think it's, as a teacher, you should try to change that culture and say, obviously, I want you to get things done as quickly as possible, but it's more about being able to get things done correctly. And also in the real world, we've now got things like ChatGPT and Gemini and AI that can get the correct answers, but the people that will succeed are the people that can explain to others, that can convince a narrative or create a narrative around the maths. So actually having the stories and the explanation behind it. So I would say tell the children actually the superpower in the future is not just getting the correct answer, but being able to explain to others how the answer is actually created.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with everything that Bobby said there. We often see this interesting phenomenon within cognitive research called the speed accuracy trade-off, where sometimes those who are very highly anxious will quite happily speed through a task because they just simply want to get it over and done with at the expense of actually getting things right. So it's a bit of a kind of coping mechanism sometimes. It's an avoidance strategy in that sense. And also, as Bobby says, it does, I think, feed into this idea of competition. Sometimes students kind of thrive on that, they're motivated by that competition, whereas others will feel very threatened by it. So I think being aware of that dynamic within the classroom can be quite important. But also, I think sometimes there is a fear of punishment in various ways, and which again comes from, you know, a young age within the school system, which is often tied not necessarily to speed but to completion of tasks. So I think if you have this sense of I just need to work through it quickly to complete the task, this equates to avoidance of punishment. So I think this is again something that maybe happens subconsciously over time. So having that maybe awareness that, you know, actually I'm not going to get punished if I don't quite complete this is really important. And yeah, you know, it's no wonder in some ways that, you know, students will speed through things because, as I said before, in some ways speed has become synonymous with being good at maths, you know, in the way that things are often taught, and the requirements to speed through classes and content and through, you know, constant kind of timed tests in maths from a young age. So I think, you know, some of that is kind of inherent within the education system, and probably needs to be looked at. And I would say really just, you know, where possible, look at, does something need to be timed? Maybe there needs to be an explicit instruction to not be quick, because, you know, we've shown in our research with adults, adults completing a maths task will think about time pressure when there is no overt time pressure, because, as I say, it's very kind of inherent to associate maths with doing it quickly or feeling as though you are expected to do it quickly. So I think sometimes there needs to be that, you know, explicit instruction to actually not do it quickly.
Great, really helpful, thank you. So next question, or there's two questions within this. So have you noticed a difference in levels of maths anxiety between secondary and primary students? And is there an age when maths anxiety is at its highest?
Oh, this is an excellent question, because I've seen both sides. So what I'll say is that when, on the whole, again, the generalization, children in primary, from my experience, they quite enjoy maths. It's seen as a fun thing. As part, you know, they do maths, they do history, they do geography, and they enjoy. Some of them enjoy things like Times Table, Rock Stars, and all the other various programs. But as secondary, because there's a relentless pressure to every half term get through a particular unit, and then you've got the sort of, you know, end of Key Stage 3, then you've got GCSE, and you've got to hit milestones. Maths can become quite almost like jumping through particular hoops. So there's a stage, and obviously children have got to pass exams because if they want to progress up the academic ladder. But I think the anxiety can happen when that time pressure happens. Again, in primary, I've seen with year sixes that I've worked with, the year sixes, they find maths less fun because the year six focuses, they got the SATs coming up, they got to get their times tables, so they got to get their procedures done in a timed manner. Whereas year fives, the maths is much more fun. So I think whenever there's an examined element, there's always going to be that anxiety there, and then that feeds into the maths anxiety. So I would say, as soon as exams come in, and again, this is a tricky, like, we're in a society, we want to have qualifications so people can move up the ladder, but if it's done too early, like, for example, I'm going to be controversial and say even year six SATs, obviously we need to ensure children have got the skill set, but that can mean that year six is only focused on passing an exam rather than building skills. So it's that trade-off you've got to find.
Thanks, Bobby. And Tom, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think you know, there are sort of mixed results to some extent, partly because we don't have enough, you know, big data on the subject. But on the whole, I would say that anxiety does seem to ramp up within secondary school. And I agree with Bobby that on the whole, it's a very positive picture actually within primary school. Of course, we have, you know, some pupils who experience, you know, high levels of maths anxiety, but in terms of the bigger picture, it's, you know, it's a lot more positive at primary school, and it's sort of a midpoint really within secondary school. Something does seem to change, and I think, you know, this of course coincides with a lot of developmental changes in you know, teens especially, particularly socially. And it comes back to this sort of fear of, you know, negative judgment or evaluation, maybe tied to some of the stereotypes as well around, you know, doing well in maths, for example. And there's also those pressures that Bobby mentions in terms of having to speed through content, maybe not having those opportunities to take that step back and cover things that, you know, you might be struggling with. But also the type of maths that's covered, you know, it starts to become a lot more abstract, you know, when we look at algebra and things like that. And when someone has a negative experience, they might feel a bit embarrassed that they can't get to grips with algebra, for example. They have a bad experience with a maths teacher, maybe putting them on the spot and feeling a bit humiliated, for instance. Then that can really stick with that person, especially at that age where teens can start to feel quite embarrassed, and especially in front of others. So those are the things that then people remember, and they can forget all the positive experiences because they tend to fixate on those negatives. And as well, if we look at things like algebra, geometry, it starts to be more abstract, and it starts to really rely on working memory and our ability to sort of keep information within our heads, and to even rotate diagrams, and to sort of hold information whilst we do another part of a problem, and then we retrieve that information that we kept in mental space. So this sort of notion of working memory becomes important, because if you're struggling with anxiety, you will then find maths almost doubly tricky because of that working memory aspect to it as well. So I think there's a whole kind of host of reasons why we start to see this step change, if you like, at some point during secondary school.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, we've got a few minutes left. Let's try and tackle one last question very quickly. So, to what extent does maths anxiety relate to positive emotions like interest, curiosity, enjoyment towards maths? And are positive emotions and anxiety mutually exclusive, or do they sometimes go together? Tom, do you want to tackle that one first?
Yeah, it's a fairly robust relationship in terms of enjoyability and anxiety. So generally, the higher the maths anxiety, the lower the perceived enjoyability when it comes to maths. But that correlation isn't sort of so strong that they are always going to be in that direction. And there's plenty of students who enjoy maths, but will feel some anxiety at times, and that probably is quite context specific. And if we look at students, for example, who do a maths degree at university, they might feel quite anxious doing math because there might be certain pressures, there might be social comparison if you're with peers who are also highly skilled in math. So from that point of view, you could easily be very fond of maths and want to do it, be motivated, but still experience some degree of anxiety. But what maybe is driving that anxiety could be slightly different in one person compared to the next. But there is certainly, if you look at sort of things at a population level in that linear way, there is that correlation between maths anxiety and enjoyability.
Thanks, Tom. I'm conscious we've only got 1 minute left, so I'm going to move to wrap things up, I think. So I just want to thank everybody very much for your engagement throughout the session and your brilliant questions. And I'm sorry we weren't able to get through all of them. But as mentioned at the start, what we will do is share all of the questions and the responses afterwards. So we'll make sure that we go through everything that you've shared. And I also wanted to say a huge thank you to Bobby and to Tom for their participation in today's webinar and all of the brilliant insights that they've shared. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. And to thank you both for your continued commitment to tackling maths anxiety as well. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining us today.
And thank you, Lucy, as well, for sharing so expertly.